I was really excited when we were talking about doing this because my my favorite part of my job, I love my job, and my favorite part is helping people learn how to use temporal, solve their pain points, avoid perilous pitfalls, and I'm really alliterating now, and just have fun using temporal to make being a developer easier. And so when we were talking about this, what I wanted to do was talk about some of my favorite spooky movies and hopefully have a lot of fun explaining some temporal best practices and their corresponding anti-patterns. Um, and really, I had a lot of fun putting together these slides. I laughed quite a bit. Hopefully, you laughed too. But yeah, I'm Joshua Smith. I'm a solution architect here at Temporal, and you are.
Hi, I'm Angie. I run community here at Temporal, and I've been here a little over a couple months.
For
So I'm
some
still
reason,
very new to Temporal, and so I'm gonna be, sort of like following up with questions when Josh is doing his thing, just to help folks on either end of the audience.
yeah, awesome. Yeah, and yeah, add Q&A. That's awesome. Okay, so we're gonna do a top 10 list. And I am really excited. Hopefully you like spooky movies, and maybe you'll pick up a fun spooky movie to check out after this talk. But at least hopefully these will be memorable things about ways to use temporal or avoid doing the anti-patterns. Number 10 is wrapping SDKs in scary ways. This is really just a mummy wrapping pun. That's why I chose this picture, not because Scooby-Doo has really anything to do with SDKs. But one of the things that we observe at Temporal is as people are using our SDKs, we have SDKs in lots of different languages, and developers, including myself, love to wrap libraries in other libraries and then wrap those libraries in other libraries. And a lot of times wrapping the temporal SDKs can be good. There are a lot of really good examples. Some people decide to add a layer, a thin shim layer to simplify security practices at a company or make connections to temporal cloud easier or make hooking up to metrics easy and simple for developers. And that's really great. Like adding a little bit to the temporal SDKs to make developer adoption easier is awesome. Another pattern that I actually like is when people maybe build a layer on top of temporal for new developers to do simple workflows really easily. There was a talk at our replay conference from my good friends at Cash App who talk about how to do that. That is awesome, but one of the things they did, and we recommend, is letting people also use the SDK directly, or at minimum have that like thin shim layer. Don't wrap it too deeply. And the anti-pattern here is if you wrap the temporal SDK too far, you sometimes people will hide important features or make it really difficult to upgrade the SDK as we add more features or change things. And so what I'm saying with this anti-pattern is don't wrap the SDK too deeply, where you get in a situation where it's hard to upgrade, where maintenance is really hard, or you break or hide features that are really helpful. We work really hard to make our SDKs good. We're open source. If you have opinions and suggestions for how our SDKs could improve, we'd love to hear them. So my ask is don't wrap the SDKs too deeply and work with us if you want improvements.
Nice. How would I know if I have started to delve into the realm of wrapping too deeply?
Yeah, there's a couple things that I would consider cautionary or points of concern if you experience them. The first one is if you're spending a lot of time maintaining all of your libraries on top of Temporal, ideally, if you do a wrapping of an SDK and you do it well, you can take a new version and not really worry about it. But if there's a lot of layers and you have to change a lot of code every time we release a new feature or add new things to our SDKs or even just take an SDK upgrade, that is sort of a concern that maybe you wrapped it too deeply. Another one is if developers are saying, "Hey, I want to access this temporal feature, I want to use temporal this way," and that's just completely blocked by how you've wrapped your SDK, I would say probably there's too much wrapping going on, and your mummy's getting scary, and that's a little bit of a concern. And maybe you should go to just exposing the SDK directly for those developers, or consider thinning up your wrapper. Does that make sense?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Number nine, jump scares. Not done yet. So one of my absolutely favorite movies, or series of movies, is the Scream movies. This is from, I think, Scream 2. I My wife would know better. She's a more of a Scream fan than I am. I haven't memorized them all yet. But if you watch the Scream movies, you might know that there's always a killer, sometimes two, and they're never quite done. If they defeat the killer, they jump back up again at the last minute and jump scare everybody in the audience one more time. And I was thinking about this because occasionally people use temporal and they think things are all done when they're not done yet. And this is really important when it comes to things like idempotency and local activities. So, just explaining what those are. When you're writing a function or a method in any programming language, idempotency means when you execute it multiple times, it always has the same result. You can execute it multiple times safely. And local activities are a variation of activities in temporal. And what local activities do is run as part of the workflow context. And they don't write their completion to workflow history until they all complete or something else completes. So, what can happen if you kind of put these together is you can write a workflow, you can use some local activities, and if you don't have those activities be idempotent, if something crashes, the local activities will continue to run, and that can cause surprise consequences. In one case, I was helping somebody out and they used a series of local activities to move money around. And they had idempotency keys, which are a thing you can use to guarantee your processes are idempotent. But they missed a change in the idempotency API. So their idempotency keys didn't work anymore. And what ended up happening is they had a bug. It One of their APIs they were calling was down. So the local activities kept trying to move the money. The idempotency keys didn't stop the money from moving multiple times, and a bunch of money got moved that wasn't supposed to because they thought their idempotency keys were working, and they thought local activities always wrote workflow history. So, just FYI, in general, I recommend using regular activities and not using local activities. But if you do use them, know how they work and always use idempotency when you're writing temporal activities. There's a blog about idempotency if you want to check it out. And be careful here and don't let your workflow processing jump out and not be done yet when you think it's done.
Way to bring that back. That's very nice. For the folks who are a little newer to temporal, here's a link, by the way, to that blog post, I think. For the folks who are newer to temporal, what would be, you said you don't generally recommend local activities, but they do have uses. What would be one example of why it would be a better idea to use a local activity versus a regular one?
Awesome. Um, so in temporal, just for really new people, workflows are where you define your process, and activities are the risky steps. And we have regular activities, and those do write history records. They're very simple to use. That's plan A. Local activities don't write history records until they're all completed, and they run in the workflow context. And what's really nice about local activities is if you need very, very low latency, they don't have to get outside of the workflow context to go to the activity context. They run in the workflow context. So they run in the worker process for the workflow. There are less network jumps, and they're more efficient and lower latency. That's a good example for why you'd want to use local activities. But beware, they work a little different than regular activities. So it's a little bit of these are good in this use case, but know what you're doing and know some of the downsides.
Right on. Thank you so much.
Awesome. And yeah, if anybody has any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. Would love that. This is another one of my favorite movies. It's called Totally Killer, and it has a lot of callbacks to the 80s. I was born in the 80s. I love the 80s. And the context for this movie is this is our heroine of the movie. She lives in current time, and 30 years ago, 35 years ago, there was a serial killer in her hometown who almost killed her mom. And there was these murders from a long time ago. And in current time, the killer shows up again and kills her mom. It's really like, oh no, big time horror movie. But her friend and
Spoilers,
her work,
dude. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway,
her friend invents a time machine so the movie can happen. And she goes back in time to try and stop the killings so she can save her mom in the current timeline. I'm not going to spoil it. This is an amazing movie, especially if you're a child of the 80s like me. Um, and I highly recommend it. And one of the reasons I was really excited about this example is because temporal also gives you time travel superpowers. Let's say you're working on your workflows and there's a bug in, say, one of your activities, and you have 100,000 workflows and they all hit the same bug. And maybe that bug did some math and the calculation is wrong. And all of your customers now have the wrong amount of whatever it was. Maybe your business service is a way to order widgets, and now everybody has 10,000 extra widgets, and that's really sad. So, temporal has time travel. And the way that works is every workflow, because we talked about workflow history and how that's really important, every step in a workflow is recorded in temporal workflow history, and you can rewind that using a feature called temporal reset. As an aside, if a worker pod in temporal crashes, that workflow history is also replayed. That's where our conference name comes from. And that's the workflow history concept is super important. And I love talking about it to explain how temporal works. In this example, let's say you wanted to fix that. What you could do is deploy a fix for your math activity, the number of widgets people ordered, to production, and then you can reset your workflows in batch back to an earlier step. And then what happens is temporal basically time machine rewinds all of your workflows back before that activity was called and then re-executes them through that same fixed code path. And now the math is correct. And I worked with several people who have done this in production on their workflows, and it's basically magic. Like you you have a bug in production, you can rewind and replay with the bug fixed, and it fixes all of their workflows. It's really awesome. So definitely check out Temporal Workflow Reset and how the replay functionality works of temporal workflows, and use time travel to save your mom or your workflows in this case.
that is so cool. Wow.
Okay. All right. So, number seven, an overwhelming amount of tribbles. I am a big Star Trek fan. It's not a horror show, but there is an episode called The Trouble with Tribbles where there are just so many of these little fuzzy aliens and they sort of take over the Starship Enterprise. And the analogy for this one is temporal workflow history size. Like I said, temporal workflow history is amazing. It lets you go back in time. It lets you keep track of every workflow that you've ever done. And it's very, very performant. But temporal, while it is kind of magic, is not actual magic. And one of the things you can't do is have unlimited workflow history size. And part of this reason is we want workflow replay and reset to be highly performant. So there are limits. They're pretty high, but there are limits. And one thing people can run into when they're first using temporal is assuming that workflows can have unlimited size because temporal is kind of magic. And this is one area where you just need to watch out for those history limits and manage the number of tribbles, I guess. I don't know. I just really like this episode. Um, and the way you can do this is by maybe not keeping too much data in your temporal workflows. If you need to work with large data, you can access it externally to the workflow history. And you can also do things like look for if continue as new is recommended, and then continue as new as needed. That resets your workflow history. But really, the pattern here is be aware that workflow history size has a limit, and keep that in mind when you're designing your workflows.
Awesome. We have a question on the previous note from Peter, who has asked regarding batch operations. I see only signal, cancel, terminate operations in the CLI. How do I use rewind?
Oh man, and there's another question too. Um, I, off the top of my head, do not remember the syntax for batch reset, but there is a way to reset batch operations, and we can get back to you on that one. Do you want me to keep going through questions? There's a
No,
whole
I
bunch of
think
them
there's starting to be a bunch of questions, so we'll maybe hold some of those to the end. But
now.
one
Okay.
on this slide particular is from Bruce Zink, who asks, "What is the practical workflow history size limit?"
Oh, so there's a rule that someone has: don't try to do math or remember complex numbers when you're giving a presentation if it's not on the slides. Don't hold me to this, Bruce. I think the workflow history size is 10,000 events and 50 megabytes. Um, thanks, Drew. But it's in the docs, and since Drew is putting out answers to questions, he probably could look it up and share it. But I think it's 50 megabytes and 10,000 items. And there is a flag you can check for called continue as new recommended that lets you know when you're getting about halfway through or 40% of the way through to that limit. Great question. All right, I'm going to keep going, Angie.
Yep, go for it.
Okay. Number 6, crossing the streams. So I also have a deep love for the Ghostbuster movies, and it's one of those movies that has a set of rules that are unique to that universe or part of that universe, and it makes me so happy. In Zombieland, there's the rule set like cardio and double tap. If you watch an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, you know he's going to be back. And in Ghostbuster movies, don't cross the streams of the proton packs. And in Temporal, we have a rule as well, which is because workflows can be rewound, replayed, reset, they must be deterministic. Because what we want is when you're doing that back in time travel, and then fast forwarding again, we want that to be deterministic so you don't get any weird, random things that happen in the middle of your timeline. And what you don't want is to cross one time stream with another time stream. So determinism is really important. And with temporal, if you need to make a change to workflow code for a workflow that's already running somewhere, you can do that. And as long as you don't break anything deterministically, that's fine. You can change activities, for example. But if you do need to change something, we have a facility called workflow versioning and workflow patching, various ways that you can make changes to your workflow time stream without breaking existing workflows in their replay and reset. So the takeaway here is don't cross your proton pack streams or your workflow definition streams. Test for determinism and use versioning to make sure you don't have any versioning errors when you go to production.
This actually might be a good time to jump in with Neroshan's question, which is just curious about the previous example of redeploying a bug fix and rerunning. Does this not break the concept of determinism, which is the topic that you just covered? He thought that this was something that we should avoid.
Yeah, great question, Roshan. So the easiest example that you can fix with replay is a change to an activity. So temporal workflow code must be deterministic. Temporal activity code doesn't have to be deterministic, and you can change that and fix a bug and not worry about determinism problems. But um, if you need to change workflow code to fix a bug for future workflows that haven't run yet, you can make those changes, no worries, and you won't break determinism if the workflows aren't running. But if the workflows are running, you do have to do patching and versioning. Um, And if you reset back before the change, then you'll have the new code path. So that's really important with that model is you can fix a bug and then replay going forward. So hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, happy to talk further about how temporal versioning and replay works. But the easiest way to manage that kind of change is keep in mind you can change activities and not have to version because activities don't have to be deterministic.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay.
And thanks for the question.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Number five, leaving handy tools sitting there. So sometimes I watch a movie and the heroes of the movie run right by something that would be super helpful. Maybe it's a fire extinguisher, maybe it's a first aid kit, maybe it's a crowbar, um, maybe it's a flashlight. And I am like, no, why? Why don't you pick up the thing that would be super helpful to you? And I just want to jump into the movie and hand them the thing. And I have the same feeling sometimes when I'm helping people out with temporal and they're doing something and I'm like, "Oh, yeah, we have this thing that will be super helpful for building this system." And examples like that or for that include things like signals or updates or queries or how to pull. There's quite a few temporal features that are in our documentation, they're in our training. There's a really wonderful course about interactive workflows that I just love, that's pretty recent. Everybody should check that out. And then we also have a ton of samples of how to use temporal. And I recommend, being familiar with the samples and like asking about if there's a sample for the thing you're trying to do, so you don't miss a really helpful tool that will help you later. And sometimes I also recommend in movies people loot the bodies. They like defeat a bunch of guys and don't take their stuff. Like use the tools that are available. There's lots of really good helpful stuff. Okay, no questions. Number four is the mega workflow. I love this movie, The Blob. I also am a big Steve McQueen fan. I think he's a super cool guy. And the way I want to connect this to temporal is sometimes people build workflows that try to do everything. They try to model 50 different processes and really automate everything that a whole team or a whole organization might try to do in one workflow. And that can be really complex and hard to manage, and it might eat your car or a train, I guess. But there is a better way. One of the things we talk about quite a bit when working with people using temporal is modeling processes that are simple and straightforward. And if a process kicks off another process, and maybe that kicks off another process, those sound like three workflows to me, not one big workflow that does all of those things. And there's a new feature in temporal, which we talked about at Replay, called Nexus, which makes breaking out complex processes into simpler steps, and maybe management of processes between teams a lot easier. So check out Nexus. Workflows should model one process, and you can break sub processes into separate workflows or use other design principles to make that maintenance simpler.
So kind of like the whole reason we do distributed systems development is not to have monolithic applications. So don't repeat that with your workflows, make them bite-sized and doing one thing.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Got it.
Number three, spooky anti-pattern, arguing with yourself. I was gonna do the man with two brains for this, but then I remembered I haven't seen the man with two brains and I didn't know what it was really about. It just fit my concept. But I loved this picture. The guy in the background is hilariously creepy and it made me laugh. So for this one, it's really good if you're not fighting yourself. Another horror movie reference that comes to mind is Ash in the Evil Dead movies. At one point, his hand becomes possessed and starts beating him up. And the relationship to temporal is sometimes people really love state machines, and they want to have a state machine in their temporal workflow. And there probably are cases where that's a good idea. Some people really love that, but I have noticed that sometimes the state machine can have a list of the next possible states and, valid states to transition to. And the workflow can have that too. Sometimes they can be in conflict. And at a minimum, it's duplicate maintenance. We have some really great webinars about state machines and workflows and when to use which one. And for this one, I'll just recommend if you're going to use temporal to model your processes and model process state, you probably don't need an extra state machine. You can probably just use the code first development of temporal to make state management really, really easy. And I love to have those conversations and talk through that process. So um, don't have split brain, use temporal to manage process state. Oh, Angie is talking and I can't hear her.
Ah, rookie mistake. I said, great tip. We have a question on the previous point about breaking things up into smaller workflows. So Dave Yarwood is asking, can you expand more on the benefits of making workflows smaller and simpler? It sounds good on the surface, and I can already think of one example where my team is not doing this, but I'd like to have some concrete reasons that I can present for breaking it up in smaller workflows. What are the benefits?
So I think for me, maybe I'm going to oversimplify it. It's not super sciency. It's just, is it easy to keep the whole process in your head at one time? If you really want to read a lot about it, you can read books like Domain Driven Design and understand things like two pizza teams and, managing complete systems and systems theory. And there's a lot of really smart people who have written a lot of smart books about application design. But for me, I'm not the smartest, biggest brain person, and I can only keep so much in my head. And if a workflow gets so complex that I can't keep it all in my head, I get nervous about operating it in production and making sure I understand how that process is going to work. And I get nervous about maintaining it. And so if the developers on your team, Dave, are feeling like, this workflow is just super complex and I'm not sure like how to understand it all at once. I can't keep it all in my head. That's usually the biggest caution sign I have that maybe it needs to be split up and maybe certain parts of it could be pushed down into a sub workflow, like a child workflow or a workflow you call separately. Um, or maybe there needs to be some abstraction of concepts away, like this complex piece needs to be put into a function and not just be in the main workflow code. There's a bunch of different ways to simplify workflows, but the biggest thing that I worry about and is my recommendation to you, Dave, is does your brain hurt when you try to think about the whole workflow? And if it does, probably need to make it.
Yeah. Probably also a component of like how easy is it to debug if something goes wrong, right? If it
Yeah,
goes wrong and the workflow is called process the credit card or something like that, then you know what failed. If it's called do all the order stuff, that's going to be much trickier.
exactly. Okay.
Yeah, there are some other
Uh,
questions, but I'll either work them in or we'll get to them at the end. So I want to.
okay.
You're doing great. Keep it going.
Cool. We're doing good. All right. Um, I love horror movies. You figure that out. And horror movies are so popular they make it into commercials sometimes. And in this case, I can't remember the company exactly, but there are a group of teenagers and they're running around between a spooky cabin and the spooky woods. And at one point, they have the idea to hide behind the chainsaws. And you and the audience and the spooky bad guy wearing the scary mask looks at the camera at the audience and shakes their head and is like, these teenagers are just going to die and they're going to die way too early. And that always made me laugh. And every time I watch a movie and the characters just do something completely stupid that gets them killed, I'm like, don't hide behind the chainsaws. And that makes me laugh. But on a serious note, I have helped customers who kill their workflows too soon. And one recommendation I have about that is um, when you're developing and designing workflows and you're calling activities, you can customize the activity retry policy. So by default with Temporal, when you call an activity, it'll retry forever. And this is awesome because you can call a database or call an API or some other external thing. And when you call them and it doesn't work, you don't have to write any retry code. You just write the code to call the thing, and Temporal will automatically retry activities until they work, which is amazing. It really can simplify the work you're doing. And sometimes people want to customize things and they customize the retry policies. So they might say, I only want this to retry 3 times or take only a few seconds or something like that. There are some timeouts and retries you can set. And some workflows really need that. They have to finish really quickly or they have to respond super fast. There are reasons to do that, and there's a reason we allow that customization. But by default, if your workflow can run anywhere from the fastest time, like 2 seconds, or retry and take maybe 10 minutes, and that's okay for your business process, don't customize your retry policies because if you do and that thing doesn't work, and it takes more than 3 tries and then doesn't respond, that will fail your workflow. And then your workflow will be failed in production. And I've worked with a lot of people who are like, oh no, all my workflows are failed in production. And I asked them why. And they said, well, I only wanted to retry this call 3 times. And I said, okay, but can it try more than that? Wouldn't it be better that your workflows just eventually succeed? And they're like, oh, yeah, that would be great. I just thought I had to customize that. The moral of the story is let your temporal activities retry if that fits your business process. Use the defaults. They'll automatically succeed eventually if you let them, and then they won't die too soon like the young people in this commercial.
Amazing. By the way, Bruce Zink has piped up and said that that is a Geico commercial, apparently.
Thank you, Bruce.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yes, and kudos to Geico. It's a great commercial. All right. Spooky anti-pattern number one, hiding in a room with one exit. If you couldn't tell, not only do I love horror movies, I love all the people in the horror movies and I want them not to die. And so in this case, I'm sure you've all seen a movie where someone's running away from the bad guy and they run into a room and they hide and then the bad guy walks through the one door and they're trapped. And you're like, "Oh no, why have you done this? You're going to die." And in the temporal case, workflows can be like this too. You can write a workflow where you think everything's going to work. And if everything works, my workflow is going to work. But what if something doesn't work? What do we do then? And it's when people are first writing temporal workflows, it's tempting to say, oh, well, if this doesn't work, I'm just going to fail the workflow and call it good. And that'll be the end of that process. But what's interesting about temporal is we make it really easy to elevate your thinking and think about what happens when things go wrong. Can we still set things to right? This is all kind of up in the air. So I'll give a concrete example. Let's say you're writing a business process that does booking and you want to book a rental car and an airplane and a hotel. So you start your business process, you book the car, that works great. You book the hotel, that works great. You go to book the flights and something goes wrong and the flight can't be booked. If you don't give yourself a way out, a way to succeed, you might just stop there and be like, oh no, you booked the car and the hotel, but we're stuck and the process failed. And you give the user an error and they have 2 reservations they can't use. But there is a technique in programming called compensation. Sometimes people talk about it in the context of doing a saga pattern, where if you do something and then you can't proceed, you undo the first thing. So in a reservation case, you would fail on the airplane reservation and then you'd unreserve the hotel and the car. And you tell the user, hey, I couldn't succeed with all 3 of the things you asked me to do, so I backed them all off. And this is really great in the context of a business process, not a technical failure. So activities like we talked about can handle technical failures really well. Maybe an API is down temporarily or a database is slow temporarily. That's fine. Use activities. But if there's a business failure, like you couldn't make a booking because the plane is full, Or let's say you're trying to move money and you take money out of account A and try to put it into account B, but then account B doesn't exist or isn't valid. Well, you want to put the money back into account A. That's success from a business model. And temporal lets you think at a higher level and think about how to manage these complex business scenarios so that if you ask someone, a user or a business person, hey, if I can't do step two, what should I do about step one? And they give you an answer, you can program that into your workflows so that they can always succeed. And that's really an awesome way to make your workflows always survive and be successful. Because as much as I love horror movie side characters who happen to die because they went into a wrong room, I also love workflows and I want them also to live and be happy and successful. So give yourself an out, use compensation to have a backup plan in case your main plan fails, and watch the Scream movies.
If you have one takeaway from today's session, watch the Scream movies. That's
Yeah.
the
All right. So we have a little bit more time, and I had some bonus spookiness I wanted to cover. Also, I really loved this picture. It made me laugh. And these are maybe not so much anti-patterns, is just horror themed suggestions from someone who loves to help people use temporal. So, number 11, bonus spookiness, wandering into a dark alley. I guess it's still a Scream movie. This is Scream 4. This is a wonderful actress. She's in a lot of really great movies, but she went into a dark alley here, and you can guess what happened. Pro tip, don't go into a dark alley. Temporal has lots of ways you can understand how your workflows are working. We have metrics for your SDKs and their performance and how they're doing for the temporal cloud service, so you can understand how well that's working and what's going on there. We have the temporal UI, which lets you see all your workflows, and we also have visibility where you can set, for example, search attributes and find out where your workflows are and search for them. So don't go into a dark alley. Use metrics and visibility.
And especially don't go down a dark alley with only one exit. We already covered this. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. All right. I also love vampire movies, and I love the Twilight movies a lot. They're just hilarious to me. And there's also a couple of other vampires that are my favorites. So in this one, you don't want vampires to suck up all of your blood, or in this case, um, be aware that that temporal, this service, has sort of a fixed capacity. So I work with a lot of people who self-host temporal, and one of the things that can happen is there is a workload on their temporal server that uses more resources than they expect, and it soaks up all the resources, and they have performance problems, and that's kind of sad. And so my recommendation here is use rate limits to limit those and prevent noisy neighbor problems or vampires sucking your blood, I guess. Or you can move to temporal cloud, and our SaaS capacity make sure that you don't suck up all your resources. So, and I just like vampire movies. All right. And my last bonus one is from the X-Files. This is Fox Mulder. If you are a fan of the X-Files, you know that um, that Mulder and Scully don't stick together. Like they're like one of the greatest TV partnerships ever, and they're always like wandering off. And this is sad to me because Mulder is the one who believes in aliens and spookiness, and Scully is the one who's the scientist and only believes in things she can prove. And they always split up in the last act of every episode, and Mulder sees the aliens and Scully doesn't see the aliens, or one of them like gets beat up by the bad guys but the other one doesn't, and it drives me nuts. I think they should stay together, and in general, in horror movies, don't split the party, don't go it alone. And this is just my ask to all of you. One of the great things that I can do at Temporal is help people use Temporal, use best practices, have a lot of success. And everybody at Temporal loves helping out our customers. So my ask is don't go it alone, don't split the party, join the community, work with us. Let's build some awesome applications together. I think that is just wonderful. And I think Angie put the Slack link. Is that right? That's our community
Yeah,
Slack
that's
link right
right.
there.
So yeah, if you click, well, click. Let me paste the link in here actually, and you actually can click it. But yeah, this is how you get to our community Slack. There's, I don't know, 13,000 some odd folks in there, including temporalites such as Josh and myself, as well as other users of Temporal with a lot of different use cases. It's a great place to hang out and meet other developers and find out about new stuff coming down the pipe and all kinds of things. So encourage you to join it. It's also how you find out about silly things like spooky stories that we're doing right now. On the note of spooky stories, Josh, I wanted to talk about a little bit about what we have coming up next in this sort of month of mayhem. So if you want to keep an eye on all of this and find the links to all this stuff, you can go to this link, which is temporal.io/blog/spooky stories. But in particular, we got a couple of more like of these live Q&A type events coming up. So next week, we have Daniel Abraham, who's a founding engineer for AutoKitty and also has run infrastructure teams at places like Google and Datadog, so really knows his stuff. He's going to be talking about deployments and how those can spiral into complexity and how a temporal can help with that. And then we have our CTO and co-founder Maxime, who's going to be talking towards the end of the month about this spooky ghost of temporal's past. So kind of what were the problems in distributed systems computing that led to the creation of temporal and why were features developed and this kind of thing. And I wanted to thank Josh for the suggestion on that because that's a great idea for a session and it gets to us to spooky ghosts and it's all good all around fun. And then finally, providing that certain hurricanes temper themselves a little bit, we have Tio from our support team talking about terrifying tales from the temporal trenches, and he will walk you through how he thinks about troubleshooting an application when something goes wrong and the different steps to take and how to isolate stuff and which benchmarking metrics to use to kind of track things and things like that. So should be a good time. And now we're going to transition to answering the rest of the Q&A. Thanks so much for your patience, folks, while we got through the session. The most important question, obviously, in here is from Peter, who has question of the day. Does Josh like the Blade movie?
Uh, yes, I do. Yeah, I'll say yes. Not my top end favorite because I tend to like the hijinks and sort of comedy of some of the other movies, and that one's very serious, and Blade is sort of a badass, which I like. Just depends on the day. I don't know. I think a more important question is, Angie, do you like the Blade movie and what are your favorites?
So I'll be honest, like horror is not really my thing, but it seems to always be my partner's thing. So I'm like horror adjacent to different things. And so like I saw like the movie, there's 28 Days Later that scared the bejesus out of me. And then there's like
Yeah.
a mockery of that movie called like, oh, you might know. But anyway, it's like it's a comedy version of it. And even that scares me. So like that's how much of
Oh,
how much of a horror buff I am anyway.
well, thanks for doing the spooky stuff with me then. I didn't know you hated them so.
No, no, no. I love the genre. It's just I am like a
Okay,
wuss and I have to like, grip somebody's hand very tightly when I'm involved in a horror situation. So.
I love it.
All right, we'll bring it back to temporal again. So Giovanni Benetti has asked, when a worker crashes in the middle of a local activity, does it run again in the next workflow rerun?
Yeah, so this is a really important question. Getting back to what I was saying about local activities, the way local activities work is they run in the workflow context and they don't write a history record until the the sequence of local activities, if you have a series of them, completes, or something else runs to record history. So, what to answer your question, if a worker crashes in the middle of a local activity, yes, the local activity will run again um, in the next workflow rerun for that workflow instance. So you've got a workflow, the worker running it crashes. And then as soon as another worker picks up that workflow or the original workflow restarts and pick up that workflow, that local activity will run again. But just so you know, regular activities work that same way as well. If you're executing an activity and it hasn't completed yet and the worker crashes, when the next worker picks up that workflow, it'll rerun that activity from the beginning there are a few exceptions to that related to heartbeats, but yes, for both local and regular activities, it'll rerun. So a good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, David Cohen has asked for tracking for tracking process state. Wow, my mouth quit working. For tracking process state through the workflow, do you have any suggestions for keeping history long term? We only keep our workflow history for so long, so we'd be losing the final state after some time.
Yeah. So this is a really wonderful question, and I love it when people ask because it leads me to two different branching paths. And I'll talk about both. So the simplest case is you can use a feature in Temporal Cloud called workflow export, where when workflows are completed, you export them. And you can use this for things like analytics, or maybe you need to keep workflow history for a regulatory reason. There are lots of reasons you just want to keep them archived just in case to know what happened. There's also a workflow archive feature for the open source self-hosted temporal. Um, so either way, you whether you're using the temporal cloud open source or the self-hosted open source, you can use workflow history export. But it always makes me ask the question, what do you need these workflow histories for long term? A lot of times what I've noticed is people model their process and they like let's say it's ordering pizza. So you start the workflow when the order comes in, you close it when the pizza is delivered or handed off and the billing is charged. But there is some sort of business process step, maybe up to 120 days in the future, you want to be able to update that order because they want to add a retroactive discount or something. Like people want to keep that workflow around, so they can work with it, so they can update it, reopen it, and that is always a sign to me that the business process actually doesn't end until really 120 days after the order is closed. So one of the things I would just suggest to you, David, is if you need to interact with that workflow for whatever your usage is, um, in a long time in the future, I'd like to understand or suggest you think about what that is and if it's part of maybe a bigger workflow, a bigger business process, or a process that just really doesn't end until something in the future. Like there's no ability to retroactively add a discount to your pizza order or whatever that is. And if that's the case, I would I would have your workflow just have a long sleep at the end for whatever that is, and maybe listen for signals or updates for whatever last step is that you want to have your workflow history for. My brain's a little tired, so maybe I didn't make that make much sense. But consider that maybe the business process doesn't actually end when you're ending your workflows now, that it actually continues on into the future.
Awesome. And then the way to handle that is kind of take the max value of how long it could possibly put a sleep for that amount, and then in the meantime listen for a unique signal that's like, okay, it actually finished whatever it was meant to do. It
Yeah,
the killer escaped and came back or whatever, we're monitoring for, and then yeah,
yeah.
okay, awesome.
Or whatever might happen. Like in the pizza example, if you can add a retroactive discount, have a signal that can listen for that discount and then reapply the discount in the billing. You know, there's ways to work with whatever the real last step is. Maybe we're getting back into the horror movie where it's not quite dead yet, but what have a have build whatever that real last step is into the workflow instead of ending it early, and then you don't need to worry about the workflow ending before you need to take action.
Amazing. All right, I will keep the line open for a couple more seconds, see if there's any other questions. But I just want to say thank you to everyone who attended. Thank you, Josh, for the awesome
Yeah.
information. This has been great. I really appreciate all the questions folks asked too. They were really great questions that I think a lot of other people would have as well. So there was a question at the very beginning, which was, is there going to be slides and stuff available? And yes, the answer is yes. So we're going to take this, put the recording out. There's also going to be an accompanying kind of like written blog posty kind of thing, so that there's like a, sort of a reference guide as well as this talk recorded. And then Josh, are you cool making the slides available as well? Because the slides are honestly the best part of your whole talk. Like, fun facts and stuff, but honestly.
Yeah, for sure. We can share the slides wherever. That's no problem.
Okay. Well, there's no more questions, so we'll give everyone 7 minutes back. Thank you so much for going. Oh. We got one more question. That was just under the wire. Nicely done, Danilo. Keeping the suspense up. I like it. All right. So Danilo
Yeah.
asks, are there some common steps to spot determinism in the workflow?
So if I understand your question correctly, if you're looking for ways that there is non-determinism in a workflow, um, some of this is, oh man, there's more questions coming
There's
in.
more. See,
This is great. Thank you. Um, if you're talking about changing workflows, you can do determinism testing in the temporal, like let's say it's in the Java SDK. There is a facility in the Java test suite for temporal to replay a workflow and detect if there's any determinism breaking changes as part of a test. And that's documented in our training and in our docs. But if it's like, hey, I'm just writing code for the first time and I want to know if it's deterministic, some of our SDKs, I don't remember off the top of our head which ones, have determinism checkers. Python, for example, has a sandbox that helps guarantee determinism. And there are features in certain SDKs that we basically remodeled in our SDK, or in certain languages that we remodeled in our SDK to be deterministic. An example is like Go has selectors, and there's a workflow specific version of selectors that is deterministic in Go. So it kind of depends on your language and your SDK, but those are some tips about how to spot determinism. And if you do write workflow code and it's non-deterministic, you'll just get a non-determinism error. So one brute force method is just write your workflow and it'll be non-deterministic and you'll get an error. But yeah, there's testing different facilities.
awesome. What Peter asked, what is the best source to learn entity workflows, aka the actor pattern?
Well, I think we have done some like community or webinars about them on the temporal side. There's actually some really good writing in the industry about the actor pattern. Doing it particularly with temporal, yeah, I would recommend looking at some of our blogs and webinars. And if you ever just want to know more, happy to like the community can help support talking about that, discussing your design, things like that. But I would start with what's out there already, um, like the resources we published already. Yeah,
Okay.
thanks. I see you posted the blog, so thanks.
Yeah, I'm trying to follow the bloody trail and leave some links for folks to
Thank
look
you.
up. Okay. Giovanni asks, if we still have time for a last question, do you have suggestions for workflow versioning? Maybe name workflows such as V1, V2, and so on.
Yeah, Giovanni, great question. Real quickly, there is a course in temporals training that's free that covers versioning as a topic. And at a very high level, you can version workflows with V1, V2, just like that. You can also patch workflows. I like that a lot. And we're working on a way to do worker versioning, which has been in pre-release for a while, but we're going to relaunch that, I think, in a better way. But first place to go, I would go to the training. It's wonderful. Our training team's done a great job, and that course is free. So check it out.
Amazing. How to identify temporal servers running out of resources? What metrics would you need to check to find that out?
Yeah. So At a very high level, you can look at like workflow success latency if that's really, really high. I mean, even if you just look in the temporal UI and you're like, man, this workflow took a long time to get going, then you can say, oh man, I don't know why my temporal workflows are taking so long. Maybe my server's out of resources. I worked with people and their workflows would take hours to start. That's a good sign they're having some vampires sucking up all their resources. But yeah, I would check workflow success latency, schedule to start, you know, the both for workflows, schedule to start and activity schedule to start. And you can always just look at your temporal self-hosted server and see if it's running low on CPU and memory, just as a first quick pass.
Awesome. And I also know that Tio's talk on the 31st is going to cover
Yeah,
a lot of these benchmark metrics to track in order to catch these kinds of problems early and often. So
perfect point. Yep.
awesome. All right. We're going to wrap it there. Thank you again so much, everyone. Thank you, Josh, for your time. And yeah, we'll see you at the next one. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye bye.